Hey, welcome, guys. Today, Will and I are going to be talking, hashing, discussing, whatever word you want to use with this, about raising in your time and material rate. And it's such a cool topic to be able to go through because I've been in this situation many times where the question is asked, do I need to raise my time and material rate? Will, you been there?
Absolutely. You get asked that topic of discussion all the time. Happy to kind of pick that apart and go through it. I got a lot of thoughts on it.
Okay, so let's start off. So I'm going to ask you a question inside here. Why would someone want to raise their time material rate? Like, what do you hear as like reasons?
I think a few of the reasons that prompt that initial question, one is we're busy, right? We're busy responding to a lot of time material or leak calls or NTE calls. Should we increase, right? Are we cheap? There's that self doubt of are we in line with our competitors? So I think that's part of it. The other is just kind of reanalyzing, are we even at the right rate to begin with? Those are the two things I see.
So, 100% agree. And number one, you were right on track, right? My wording is just a little bit different. It's like they see everyone else's rate and they're like, man, mine's lower than everybody else. And I think it becomes that like self-perceived of like, I could be making more money, or maybe we're undercharging, right? Which kind of goes
Hmm.
right back to what you said, the second point of like, was my rate ever right to begin with? So how
No question.
in your world, how starting a new business, something like that, like how do you figure out the rate that you need to be? Like how did you break that down?
Good question. And I think that some people don't, some people it's just kind of like a judgment call and then they just say that's what we're charging. Others, it's kind of what we've always charged. But if you're starting out, then you really got to figure out what your margin should be, your fixed margin should be, and work back into that labor rate. I mean, that's what a labor rate should be. It's like a forecasted or expected amount of profit per hour that we work. You can work more hours in the day, but the margin should be locked. So for me, in the contractors that I work with, it's all right, what are the costs of the employees? What's the cost of the vehicle? What's the overhead? Let's figure that ratio out and then set the labor rate directly from the facts.
Love that. So yes, 100%. But in order to have that, you have to know what the end is, right? Because you're going to say, okay, like margin. I don't even know what that, I mean, as a new contractor, it can be like, I don't even know what that is. Like, what is margin, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like gross margin, what's the difference between gross margin and net? And I think those are really, really good talk topics, not for this one, but what you're saying is absolutely right. What's the cost, right? And then what type of burden do you have, right? Do you pay insurance? Do you have any type of taxes, anything else that goes back into that employee to figure out the raw cost of that employee? Because I think that's part one, right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely, and I think that a lot of contractors are thinking ahead too on how they formulate that labor rate. And there's variances too, because a lot will charge more for extra hours or nights and weekends and in overtime and trying to align that. But if you think long term, how is it going to end up being accounted for? How do I count all of and a lot of people do job costing by work orders too, and that puts a lot of extra work to consolidate or reconcile, whatever you want to call it, at the end of the day. But for contractors that you're working with that have that labor rate, that pose that same question to you: should I increase? Should I back down? Where am I at? What are the kind of bullet points you pull from that kind of conversation?
So number one goes directly into what you said, gross margin, right? So gross margin is ultimately the funds that you have left after you produce the job. And that's direct funds, right? So direct funds goes into travel, labor, materials, and then I'll say other, but other could be like you needed a lift, you needed a dumpster, you needed whatever it was, right? But that's your direct cost, and it's two things. So number one is your labor, which your labor is going to be your most expensive thing that you have, and then number two is like your materials and other, and I'll throw both of those together, um, because your material markup, which we haven't even got into, is part of your gross margin. So what I'd like to talk a little bit about is I'm always on the fence that I don't want to increase my time material rate unless I have to.
Hmm.
I've ran into a lot of situations that where I'm having conversation and it's like, well, I'm going to change my rate from 85 to 90 bucks an hour, just for an example, right? And I pulled some math before this. And if I was to change my labor rate from 85 to $90 an hour, I'm going to give you just some raw math so you guys can see it, right? So average service ticket, 750 bucks. On the same page with that, Will?
Yeah, totally fair.
Okay. Average split between a ticket, 70-30, which means 70% of the ticket is labor, right? Travel, on-site, that stuff. 30% is your materials. Always the white elephant that I have a retrofit drain. Always the white elephant that I'm using modified. Always the white elephant that maybe not so white at this point, but like I'm torching it. I got a 2-hour fire watch, right? But still,
Yeah.
that goes right into labor time. So I've typically seen like a 70-30 split is a safe number. So if we pull those numbers and I was to change my labor rate to 85 or from $85 to $90 an hour, it ultimately changes my revenue, okay, total revenue of it by $15. Like that's what I look at, right? Like is a 5% change, right? Or a $5 change, sorry, 85 to $90. Is it really going to make the impact that you want into the business? Does that make sense?
It does. It puts it in perspective. It changes the way that a lot of people look at it. Because if you actually follow through with going to the end and actually calculating out your cost differences, that might be part of the reason too of kind of self-checking. But I often see people just raise the rates because everyone else is doing it. It's not because they just went through that exercise and did the math and saw the outcome of it. I think that you should charge a fair market value for your services. But I think, and I see this a lot of attention, hours, um, effort going towards job costing those time material tickets. And in my opinion, you're never going to get it perfect. You'll never get it perfect, right? Because in service, let's say you run 3 jobs in a day, all time material jobs that you ran that day. Are you really going to spread that tank of gas across those 3 jobs, right? Are you really going to spread that tube of caulk across those jobs? So then what happens is one becomes inflated and the other ones look bad. So
Yeah.
I think kind of going into it, pre-estimating what your rates should be and sticking to it and monitoring and adjusting as needed. But I always rolled up a level and kind of job costed by, truck or maybe by type of work that you do, because that ultimately is more reliable and more accurate. Are there other forms of job costing outside of time material that you advise and that you've seen?
So again, it starts with what's the reasoning? That's always my first question, right? What's the reasoning? I want to raise it because everybody else in the area is raising their rates. Okay, cool. That's a starting point. But I'll always go back to, one, we're going to split how much time material work do you guys do versus how much contract work do you do, right? How many tickets do you run? Because if we're talking about running 100 tickets in an entire calendar year and raising your rates $10, it's not going to do anything, right? Like it's when I look at this, raising it from 85 to 90, it's 1.96% increase in revenue. And I guess that's always my question because I always have a
Yeah.
hard time on, and this is kind of an integrity side I almost look at of like, if we're going to raise our rates, one, are we going to announce it? Right. And if we announce that we're raising our rates, is that going to create any type of conflict with our customers? Right. Ultimately, conversations that we don't want to have.
Mm.
Right. So like that's number one. Now you can raise it and not announce it. But at the same point, there's a lot of people who's like, well, I'm going to raise my rates. I'm going to tell my customers. And there's a lot of back and forth on that. But I guess when it comes to raising the rate, right? Like, and this is kind of summing it up within the first 10 minutes, but like, why? Are you doing it because the competition's doing it? Are you doing it because you want more revenue? You want to increase the amount of revenue? Or are you doing it because you want to increase your gross margin? Which if you want to increase your gross margin, I would not touch my time material rate and I would focus on contracts, right? Because my contracts is going to bring in my 65% gross margin, where typically my time materials in my low 50s, right? So
Yeah.
2% change in low 50s, I can make 15% more if I just focus on that contract side. What are your
Dude,
thoughts on that?
couldn't agree more, right? No one's ever going to get rich off of time material work orders. Let's just be real, and kind of what you're breaking down there is like, are we really going to fight to get an extra 1.5% off of increasing our labor rates? Because that's really what we're doing. And there's other ways to offset that, maybe at a trip charge or like a minimum or things like that aren't directly related, although they are in a job cost standpoint. But to your point of focusing on how you actually earn profit, and that's through contract work. And I always looked at all these lead calls as, I want to convert them, in each lead call that we have, we want to, in a perfect world, we convert it while we're still there, because you could take a 50% profitable work order, upsell a drain, and it goes to 200%. It's a hard feat to pull off. Maybe we could talk about that since we have some more time. But if you went in and focused on how to get more contract work, tons of different ways to do that, now you're gaining traction. Now we're profitable. Now we're able to do more.
Yep. So it goes back to that question, right? So let's say, and I do have a spreadsheet I'm looking at, and if you guys ever want to like do one with me, game on. But like 85 to 95, a $10 jump. Okay. So that means you make approximately it's $45 more per ticket. So $45 per ticket. Take that and times that by the number of time material tickets that you've had, right? Or that you run in a calendar year. And to me, that $10 raise, right? $45 per ticket on average, right? And you guys, we can figure out real world. But at the end of the day, if you ran 100 tickets, that's $4,500. Is raising your rate $10, right? Having to have that conversation with your customer about why you're raising rates, possibly risking losing customers, right? Maybe if they're only using you because you're low dollar, not great customers, but real world there. Is all of that worth $4,500? Now, if you run 2,000 tickets, it's a completely different world, right? Raising the rate $10 times 2,000 tickets at $45 a piece, it's a different world.
Mm-hmm.
So that's always a big question that I have, right? How many time material tickets are you running right now? And raising your rate is going to do what to your gross margin? It's going to do what to your total revenue? And to me, that's always been the deciding factor is that number big enough? Right? Or is the pain big enough? Maybe like you said on profitability, I'm not making enough profit on this. But I would really look somewhere else if we were talking about profit before I looked at my time material rate, unless it was just horribly off.
Yeah, and fair enough too. And some that are just starting out, they are like horribly off because they kind of base it off of what the production crews are being paid and how they mark up production work. It's a different animal. You mentioned that you see what 55% margin on time material work. What's the low end of that spectrum that you see and like the high end of that spectrum? Because I do see some, in the 60 to 70%, and they still, they must have gotten there some way, shape, or form. But what's the spectrum that you normally see with contractors?
So first off, there's always a tolerance for me, right? Because if someone produces a time material ticket and they tell me it's at a 70% gross margin, I'm just like,
Is it?
where's it at, right? Like there's an issue with that, and not saying that if you're there's an issue, but there's something that happened to that ticket that made it that profitable. Depending on where you are, Seattle, $120 an hour. Chicago could be 110, 115, and that's normal billing rate, guys. And if you're like, holy crap, that's insane, that's probably because you're in a different metro, right? Memphis, or maybe those smaller, I'll say cities and not like metros and massive, metropolitans. It's different. And I think that you said it best, Will, right? It's like, it's what's the cost of Tech 1? What do you pay them? What's the cost of Tech 2? What's the burden? And you have to really figure out what is your burden, right? What's your burden per hour that they work? Then you got to figure out material markup because that's all going to go into your gross margin, right? And then that's how you start making like, what is my time material rate? Because your material markup is part of that. Because when we pull a ticket, and if we are job costing, like you said, per ticket, that gross margin or that markup, sorry, for materials is absolutely a part of that. And that could be a big variable too. And I'm kind of going in a little bit of the weeds here, right? But like we've had a lot of material fluctuation over the last few years. And I've worked with contractors who haven't updated their materials,
Yeah.
right? And it's still $212 for a roll of cover strip. And I was like, yeah, maybe in 2018. And like that's the reason, gross margin is low, or maybe it's high, right? What's your markup on materials, which is a whole different topic. But those are the variables that I look at before I say, okay, I'm gonna give my clients a shift. Because again, if I'm changing my time and material rate, right, that's gonna affect my customers. Where if I just find a way to better produce the ticket and work, and or I should say opportunity I already have, like we could do that with value. And that to me has been a massive area of growth versus having to send an email to every one of our customers to say, hey, June 1st, we're now $95 an hour or whatever it is.
Yeah, and I think that's fair and a good way to look at it. Other reasons that aren't necessarily financially motivating that you would want to increase your rates. I also work with a contractor that did a lot of service, right? They've always done a lot of service. It's a big part of their business, and the additional software they put in place is leading to just more and more service. So now they're raising their rates just to kind of knock off the, not to be a jerk, but the pain in the ass customers that they don't want to do business with. That's a completely different motive right there. They're not doing it from a profitable standpoint. It's like hey, we're going to up our game in terms of professionalism. We come out, we do the right repair, the warrantable repair, stand by our work, right? And you got some of those clients that pay you the least can be your biggest headache. Have you had much experience with headache clients, and how did you handle them? Because it's all about the rates, right? It's all about what you're marking up my materials. I want to see your breakdown. Sure, you've clashed with them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard world. I actually had a call earlier today where it started off and it was like, I'm dealing with the worst customer ever. And I was like, I challenge you on that. I think I know somebody worse. So that's a power move, right? And I instantly went to sales because when I was in sales and you have a strong book of business, right? You know your customers, you know where it is, and then all of a sudden you have this like, I'm just gonna say you got this crappy lead that comes in, right? And they say, yeah, hey, I'm looking at replacing my roof. If you can come give me a bid, I'd appreciate it. I'm looking for the best price and I'm gonna award it inside 1 month. Like I instantly get shut off by that. Like looking for the best price, like sorry guys, we're in Texas, right to work state. Go pick the guy in the back of a pickup truck, right? Like
Good luck with that.
yeah, there's so much. And you're right, because depending on who the customer is that you guys are working with, there are absolutely customers that will do everything possible to challenge the work order, say, hey, I see that you have 1 hour worth of labor here. My cameras show that they were here for 45 minutes, right? And those are customers that aren't necessarily valuing what you bring to the table. And I think what you're saying, right, you're going to raise those rates. I was working with a customer that had mentioned that they had a pain in the butt customer, and they actually gave that customer a discount because that customer called every single time and complained. So they gave them a cheaper rate. And it was mind blowing to me because it's like, this guy's to work with. This guy should be paying you more simply for the headache that you have. But those are the real things that are happening. So I think there's a lot of value in what you said, right? Once you get to the point to where you can say, hey, I know what my niche is, right? I know what I'm great at, right? Now we're going to start really executing on that. And value is not cheap, right? Value and cost are two completely different things.
Mm-hmm. And once you start honing in on the area that you're really good at, focusing on that part of the business and growing it, you can afford to get away from some of the stuff that perhaps you don't enjoy doing, or maybe you're not as good at, and you could have started by also, glazing windows and sealing brick and doing these other services. But then when you build up your book of business and you're established, you can choose what type of work you do. And I think a lot of contractors strive to get to that point, because that's the point in which we all enjoy what we do. No one likes breaking those invoices down for that particular client you're talking about and having those conversations and sending an invoice off and just knowing that you're going to get a phone call, right? And have to answer that call and respond to that breakdown. I would not give them a break or a discount. To your point, definitely raise the rates on them. and then stand behind your work. Look, this is the cost of doing business, but you get this from me. You get this. I always show up. I always follow up with you. Stand behind it. Totally.
What's the cost to do it the second time after the first guy who is cheaper screws it up? Is it more expensive to me? Right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of value in that, right? There's a lot of value inside having your technicians that are good, right? Because we all know like labor is super expensive to come around. But that brings up another great point, because I had a truck in one of the companies that I was in, and the truck had two people that were in the truck, and they were both foreman material, right? And this was a transition time. But I had one truck that had two foremen in it that were getting two foreman pay. It was the most expensive truck I had. Okay, by far the most expensive truck I had. But the point I'll tell you, they never run town material. Okay, they never ran town material. They were my contract executioners. If there was a contract, that crew was going on it because they knew how to get there, get the work done, and get off. Time and material is less risk. Now, there's less reward, right? Because it's time and it's material. It's static. You can work 1 hour, you can work 6 hours, and it's static. So I've always used some of, let's just say, my newer guys or someone who's going through, because if it does take them 6 hours to use it, as long as we have the NTE or the approval, there's not necessarily a downside of it. Now, on my contract side, I want my guys that know what they're doing. They know how to get up there, set the safety up, get the job done, and get off, because the quicker I can get that done, is the more profit. So, Will, as you and I start talking about that, that's also a delivery of where your guys are at, right? I had guys that only ran contracts. I had my large scope crews that only did my large scopes. But then also I had any of newer guys, or maybe some of the fresher guys that were coming in, they would go run leaks. And that would be a great way for me to train with them if it took them longer on site. Again, as long as we weren't over the NTE and we fixed the leak right the first time, those were training grounds. So understanding that, the other thing I'll say that not many people pay attention to, time and material can be your worst enemy. One, it could be your best friend because it's static, low risk, right? Travel, labor, materials, it's exactly what you used. It's static. But it absolutely is not when you're on overtime. Overtime is time and a half, guys, if not more, depending on where you're at, right? That means your billing stays exactly the same, and now you're paying your guys 50% more. And that can take your gross margin from 50% to 30%, right? Gross margin, which means on net, you're probably not making anything. So that's also something to be very, very aware of, is, are you guys doing time and material on overtime? Because again, what's the purpose of doing this, right? Maybe we can just get smarter with the time that we're doing lead calls. Or maybe it's Friday, right? And we have crews that are on 40 hours. Maybe we're going to take a crew that doesn't have 40 hours and put them on lead calls. And the crews that do have 40 hours, I'm going to put them on contracts. So shifting those employees also might be able to help you better maintain the rate. Because again, going back to it, at least from my side, if we're going to raise it $10, is it worth it? Right? Is it worth it to go from 85 to 95?
Yeah, and especially if you're not, really managing it too, because to your point about at the end of the week, everyone's over 30 hours, right? And how do we use that time? How do we value that time? You could have pre-calculated the best margin in your time, material, labor rates ever in the world, but then all of a sudden you hit overtime and it goes out the window. Now, there's ways to prevent that. You could talk to your customer ahead of time that you need to be aware of, though, ahead of time. You could, tell the client it's after hours or it's whatever it is, but that communication is key, and it's visibility to that information. And I like what you said too about assembling the right crews for the right job, because you can afford to take your higher paid guys and put them on the contract work, plus geared towards experience. And I like what you said about the low risk about lead calls. And it's true on both sides. It's low risk, in general in terms of billing, but it's also lower, I don't say low risk, but there's lower risk in going out and diagnosing leaks. Because at the end of the day, if it leaks again, you come back, you've already got some time into it, but hopefully it doesn't, but you could teach guys, entry-level guys, how to at least temp that kind of work, or even sales reps. We often had reps with a backpack with a kit in it where they could stop leaks. And if they were able to stop the leak, great. It just made us look better. But I like it. I think for some of the conversations that I see around raising rates, I think it's mostly like looking at everyone else and asking the questions too, and just not wanting to fall behind. But I love the conversation. We picked it apart, and it's like, is it really going to hurt you at the end of the day? Probably not. You need visibility. Is it fair?
It is, right? So I guess my question to you guys, if you're like, hey, do I need to change my rate? So number one, if you change your rate, figure out what your average ticket is, right? You guys have what it is. You should be able to pull all of your tickets, all your time material tickets, divide them by the number of tickets, and that's your average time material. Okay. Just run there. Then figure out what labor only is, but you should be able to pull that from your system. Divide the labor by your labor rate. That's going to give you a general idea of how many hours you guys have had. And then calculate the difference. You're going to change it 10 hours based upon 400 hours. What's the dollar amount there? Is that worth it? Right? Because like in the example that I gave you, this one ticket, right, where we changed it from $85 to $95 an hour, we gained revenue of $45. Every upsell I've ever done on site has been more than $45. So is it maybe just more logical to convert time material into a contract? Right? Not only can we make more profit, but we can increase the revenue. So again, we're taking that same opportunity that you guys have, and we're just doing more with it. And that's always my challenge when we're talking about it, because my fear is having to go, and this is my personality fear, right? Is like I have to go have a conversation with every one of these customers or my customers, right? And say, hey, June 1st, we're going to be increasing our rate. And they're going to say, why? And is that going to bring any doubt inside their mind of like, well, this is pretty expensive. Should I go somewhere? I don't want my customers to think that. Right? Now, if you can justify it and we don't say it or however you guys roll it out, game on. But there are a lot of ways to make more money than raising your NTE rate. And that's going to be my question to you guys. Is it worth it? Right? Is the $45 a ticket worth it? Is the 5% increase worth it?
I like it too. And there's one other kind of use case or contractor I was working with. This is probably about a month ago, where their whole struggle was jobs that were short lived, where they would show up and it was literally like a $250 charge. How do I handle this? We were just in and out. I can't just like fake it. I don't feel right faking it. So they implemented a minimum. Look, I got a $350 minimum. That's the cost of what it takes to show up, put a ladder up, and start investigating. And then they implemented the time material on top of the $350 minimum. But to your point, there's other ways that you can satisfy that without having to go to your clients and tell them we're raising our rates, because you're right, it does raise flags. I don't want to lose clients either. But I thought that was interesting. A good way to look at it too. Have minimums. And every contractor is different. Everyone has to travel to a different distance, and do different work. What we're saying isn't one size fits all. And that's why I love these conversations, because we get to pick it apart and interpret what we're each seeing from different angles, from different contractors in different regions. I love it.
So I'll end with a story, guys. And this is a 100% true story. And this is one that I was in. So the customer was bidding out the service side. It was a big portfolio. And they said the labor rate that we're looking at going with right now is $65 an hour. There's more details in it, but that's where we're at. Okay. I'm $85 an hour in this territory and in the surrounding territories that will service it. Okay. No way am I going to lower my rate $20 an hour to be able to do this. I'm not going to make money. Now, let me tell you what happened. There was a trip charge. They were okay with the trip charge. There was a fuel surcharge. They were okay with the fuel surcharge. They wanted that rate to be $65 an hour, right? For some reason, that was baked inside their head. Now, when we did the math throughout the fuel surcharge and the trip charge that got added to it, want to know the crazy part? They actually paid 5% more. They paid 5% more with those line items being added in, simply because they were so driven on a low dollar amount. And you already said that there, right? Like people are putting in fuel surcharge, they're putting in trip charge, the diagnosis charge. It's no different than an HVAC world, right? Show up, see what's going on. It's a diagnosis, and first hour is 175. Every hour after that's 90. Any HVAC company will do that. There's ways to be able to again make value out of what you guys have. The biggest thing that I think we need to all recognize is that every time you get that call, it's an opportunity, right, for you guys to be able to grow that relationship. Find additional stuff on site, look around, right? Act as if this is your building, do those additional site bids, because that's what's going to take you beyond just the time and material side.
That's right. Couldn't have said it better myself. So guys, thank you for joining every week. We're growing the audience. Tell your friends, share it. So just get the word out. We get to have these great conversations every other Friday, and looking forward to the next one.
Cool. Thank you.
See y'all.